Hi, my name is Deborah Wagner. Welcome to Standards-Based Grading. In this unit, I really picked this picture of the parachuters because it really shows a few of the skills that these parachuters have. Not only do they have the skill of jumping out of the plane, but they're knowing how to make this geometric pattern and connect in the sky. They're skilled as far as that. They know how to deploy their parachutes and land on the ground safely. And as we look at this picture, we're understanding that not everybody is at the same spot at the same time, but they are all going to get to the ground because of that training. And when we think about standards-based grading and implementing that system, we're really looking at that for our students. Our students are all going to hit that ground of the learning targets that we set in place for them and have expectations for them. When we think about the instructional cycle, we really want to look at the learning that happens. The learning part is where students learn skills to meet that standard. So that standard is presented to the students, and that learning takes place where students get to time to practice and work with that target or skill. Um, After the learning, we go into the assessment part. Students complete tasks to assess tasks that can be assessed um, to see if they're actually progressing to meet those standards. Now, those can be formative or summative assessments, but either way, that area goes into the grading process. So teachers indicate for each assessing standard if that standard is being met or not met. In summative assessment, there's that decision of what do we go back and reteach. Same thing with formal or formative assessment. We want to go back, provide that feedback, and see what gaps there are in the learning. So from grading, we go back into the teaching cycle. So if the standards are not met, that teacher identifies those gaps and goes back in to have the student complete tasks or skills or learn new skills or tasks that can help the student meet that goal. If the students have already met that goal, they go back into the cycle of learning a new outcome or goal. Now, when we think of types of assessments, we really want to look at the pre-assessment model, formative assessment, and summative assessment. Now, what we mean by pre-assessment is the purpose of it is to determine students' understandings of learning targets prior to instruction in the classroom. So we want to see where our students are at. And how can we use that? We want to analyze that prior knowledge to determine best how to plan for instruction to meet that student success on our learning targets. We want to see our highs and our lows. We want to see where kids might need intervention. So we want to see what background or strength they might bring to a particular unit to demonstrate that and have them help others. Formative assessments is information gathered frequently and reported for use in the developing of knowledge and skills, according to Marzano. Now, reported doesn't always mean graded. Reported means documented. So we want to see that documentation of growth is going on. And that's often sometimes what we miss. If we do a FIST to 5 and we have mostly 2s or 3s, we got to take that glimpse in our mind, but sometimes we don't always report that out or document why we're changing that in our plans or what our targets are for the learning. And it can really help to determine positive instructional strategies if we kind of report that out, document it, look at it, dive into it in our PLCs. So formative assessment also provides teachers that understanding of where a student is in that progression and learning target. And it provides students with feedback about where they are in that progression. So that student feedback is important. We're going to make sure that students understand where they are in that formative assessment. So it also allows for that reflective lesson planning. Summative assessments are really usually considered reports or judging the outcome of students at the understanding of learning target, but it's usually done at the end of the unit or at the end of a semester, at the end of the year. It's kind of like that wrap up of what information or skills or targets have students learned at the end. It's at the end of the process when a process is learned or a product is complete. Let's say there's a project that's done. It's typically presented as a grade or a rank. It allows teachers to learn students' mastery level of a learning target. Are they at an A, B, C, D level? Are they advanced, basic, or proficient? So, and it also helps us understand or demonstrate gaps in it that are in learning. So when we're thinking about the different types of standard-based grading, we can really get into that idea of how do we fill those gaps or fix those gaps if they're low. So when we do this and we're looking at standards-based grading, we really have to see, are we looking at standards-based grading, or are we looking at a standards reference system, or a combination between the two? Typical standards-based systems, the students do not move ahead until they can demonstrate competency at the current level, so that they're mastering those learning targets before they move ahead. Now, in a standards reference system, students don't progress. Students' progress is documented, but if they don't meet it, they still move on. Now, that may not always be best, because if a student hasn't mastered a previous learning standard, progressing can be difficult or challenging. So in some systems, students have the opportunity to demonstrate competency all throughout the year. So we're going to really kind of look at that and focus on different styles as we go through our process. As we move ahead, we want to ensure that the end of the year targets are in place and aligned to state and district standards, and you're doing that in your PLCs. We want to make sure our unit targets are in place and posted, and we want to ensure that daily learning targets are in place where students can see them and use them. Then we want to decide how we want to present our grades. Do we want a grading equivalency? Do we want a percent equivalency? Are we doing a ranking system where students are ranked advanced, proficient, basic, or below basic? Or are we using a number system that's aligned to our rubrics? And it shows or demonstrates to students, teachers, or parents what skills those students have. We also want to decide what gets graded for reporting, whether it's the homework is graded, whether a feedback assignment is graded, whether a form and assessment is graded, or whether a summative assessment is graded. Now, we want to dig into some research on that. And in the book, The Standards-Based Classroom, we already have a report out, or teachers' reflections on how they went about deciding what gets graded. And they initially thought, well, if homework's not graded or formative assessments aren't graded, the students aren't going to have the desire to do them, so they're not going to learn in order to produce anything on the summative assessment or gain mastery for that target. What some teachers are finding out is with appropriate feedback on homework and formative assessment, students are actually doing better on summative because feedback can be impactful. And Marzano agrees with that. So as we look ahead, we also want to determine which types of standard-based model we'd like to implement in order to have a best student impact on achievement. So there's a summative score assigned at the end of a grading period, the gradual accumulation of summative progress, the whole class passes on as one, or the continual improvement model. Summative scores at the end of the grading period are just that. That summative score is at the end of a unit, or at the end of the semester. One of the strengths of that is students understand what they're expected to learn if those targets are posted at the end of each unit and at the end of each class. It's easy to track. There's a clear beginning point and an ending point. Some of the weaknesses, some students may be concerned if they don't get high scores. So students become disengaged if those scores aren't met, or those mastery levels, the learning targets aren't met. Students also do not always see that these lower scores in the beginning of a unit will get better as they learn, as they move on. So those formative assessments in the beginning that aren't showing that they're great, they don't always get those mastery levels because they are checked out by the time that summative assessment gets there. In a gradual accumulation of summative scores, those summative scores are added onto. So they're like mini summatives throughout the whole process. So those individual or daily targets are kind of added in. So a strength to that is evidence is gathered throughout the whole unit, not only at the end. Students also in this process track their own progress. It's very individualized and it's very student-centered. One of the weaknesses is it's more labor intensive because it requires frequent meetings with students to assess and analyze that progress. And the whole class progresses as one model. It's just that at the end of the unit, the whole class moves into unit 2. At the end of that unit, they all move into unit 3. At the end of the semester, they all move into semester 1. And some of the strengths of that is it looks familiar to students and families. It's very similar, even if it's standards based, to what our students are facing now, that unit to unit, day to day progression. Some of the weaknesses in that is, or some another strength is students tend to receive higher scores um, because they only assess on that current learning objective. Some of the weaknesses of that it doesn't always address our students' needs and the intervention or extensions when the whole class progresses as one. It can frustrate students who need intervention or already know the content, and some students move into the next progression without being ready for it. So if students haven't mastered to how to identify slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b, and now they're expected to graph, sometimes they don't catch on to that next target or that next progression. And a continual improvement plan is just that. Those standards, the whole year standards are laid out. And as students improve on those, all of that is reported out on throughout the entire year. A strength of that is students can increase learning target scores throughout the whole year. The intent is every score scores proficient or higher. And what that means is in homework completion and in formative assessments, really there's a no opt-out policy that teachers are really looking for these students. If it's important enough for me to assign as homework, it's important enough to do. It's how we get to the meeting these goals. And another strength is students typically take more responsibility for their learning. Some of the weaknesses, it's highly labor intensive keeping these records all throughout the year. So getting some computer knowledge or background knowledge and setting it up well in the forefront is beneficial to this. And another weakness is it's very different looking to our families and our students than current grading systems. So we have to ensure our teachers know how to use it, and we want families to understand how to use this type of system also. So no matter what system we put in place and how we want our standards-based grading to look, we really have to understand where we're going with this and what we want. So some other steps ahead is we want to use that current curriculum, learning objectives, and progression targets to create these rubrics for standards-based grading and ensure that staff understands how to grade using that rubric model. We want to introduce this standards-based grading to our families and our students. We want to give them that foreloading. We want to introduce this and give them practice to it as we're moving ahead and offer them support and understanding why it's beneficial. We want to ensure students are aware of the learning targets and model of grading. So we want students to practice that over and over, especially in the beginning, so that they understand how to use this as a tool to learning, not just report out on grading. Because if we teach them how to use the tools, they're going to master that skill versus just it's done for them. The grade is there. We're going to use our meetings and PLC and PD days to use data to drive progress in instructing to the standards. And we're going to allow times for teachers to collaborate on lessons that can help all students achieve these targets. It's all important as we move ahead. Now, we know as we go through this process, there's going to be questions, so feel free to reach out to me as we move on ahead.